Let's talk about Chapter 30. To Cheris Kramer, language is a man-made construction. Women's words and thoughts are discounted in our society. And when women try to overcome this inequity, the masculine control of communication places them at a disadvantage. Women are considered a muted group because man made language aids in defining, depreciating, and excluding them. Anthropologist Edwin Ardner first proposed that women are a muted group. He noted that many ethnographers claim to have cracked the code of a culture without referencing female speech. He and Shirley Ardner discovered that mutedness is caused by the lack of power that besets any group of low status. Mutedness doesn't mean that low power groups are completely silent. The issue is whether people can say what they want to say when and where they want to say it. He claimed that muted groups are black holes because they are overlooked, muffled, and rendered invisible. Kramer argues that the ever-prevalent public-private distinction in language is a convenient way to exaggerate gender differences and pose separate sexual spheres of activity. Kramer's basic assumption is that women perceive the world differently from men because women's and men's different experiences and activities are rooted in the division of labor. Kramer argues that because of their political dominance, men's systems of perception is dominant, impeding the free expression of women's alternative models of the world. Men's control of the dominant mode of expression has produced a vast stock of derogatory gender-specific terms to refer to women's speech. There are also more words to describe sexually promiscuous women than men. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis suggests that muted women come to doubt the validity of their experiences and the legitimacy of their feelings. The issue of gender-specific pronouns and terms is highly relevant to muted group theory. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is a good vehicle for understanding the potential effect of non-inclusive language. How might a male flight attendant feel if passengers referred to him as stewardess? This is now why we use the term flight attendant, to be more inclusive to both men and women in that profession. We can also take a look at this thought one step further. The commonplace usage of the terms guys and girls places power in the male camp. While guys is more likely to reference post-adolescent young adults, the term girl is a child. Thus, they're not parallel forms of address. The truly parallel terms would be guys and gals, men and women, boys and girls, and the like. While gals may seem awkward, it only feels that way because we're not accustomed to hearing it. Another example of this is in segregated sporting events. For example, we have the NBA and the WNBA. Why not the MNBA and WNBA? Baylor made a move against this division and towards inclusion when it dropped lady from the women's sports teams' names. Even if the public mode of expression contained a rich vocabulary to describe feminine experience, women would still be muted if their modes of expression were ignored or ridiculed. Kramer points out that both the law and the conventions of proper etiquette have served men well. Kramer observed that most gatekeepers are men, a good old boys cultural establishment that historically has included women's art, poetry, plays, film scripts, public address, and scholarly essays. Mainstream communication, then, is male-stream expression. Authors such as Virginia Woolf and Dorothy Smith have argued that women have not been given their rightful place in history. Many women have suppressed their feminine identity to satisfy the demands of a male gatekeeper. To some extent, Kramer thinks advances in technology create new spaces where women can make their voices heard. But tech executives have noted that these programs are likely to simply reflect the social mores of a culture they're processing. Facebook's chief operating officer, Sheryl Sandberg, believes technology won't reflect the entrance of female users until we have more women in the technology fields. This is known as algorithmic oppression, or the bias encoded in social media and search engine that favors dominant groups and oppresses marginalized groups. Kramer believes that in order to participate in society, women must transform their own models in terms of the received male system of expression. This translation process requires constant effort and leaves women wondering if they've said it right. According to Kramer, women have to choose their words carefully in public forums. She also believes that females are likely to find ways to express themselves outside the dominant public modes of expression used by males. She labels women's outlets as the female subversion that runs beneath the surface of male orthodoxy. She's convinced that males have more difficulty than females understanding what members of the other gender mean because they haven't made the effort. Others hypothesize that men realize that listening to women would involve a renunciation of their privileged position. The ultimate goal, then, of muted group theory is to change the man-made linguistic system that oppresses women, including challenging sexist dictionaries. Traditional dictionaries pose as authoritative guides to proper language use, but because of their reliance on male literary sources, lexiconographers systematically exclude words coined by women. Kramer and others have compiled a feminist dictionary that offers definitions for women's words that don't appear in other dictionaries, and presents alternative feminine readings of words that do. The popularization of the term sexual harassment represents a great victory for feminist communication scholarship. It encodes women's experience into the received language of society. Although unwanted sexual attention is not new, until recently it went unnamed. The battle over sexual harassment is as much a struggle over language as it is over sexual conduct. Communication professor Ann Burnett at North Dakota State University identified similar confusion and powerlessness regarding date rape, an acute form of sexual harassment often directed at college women. Uncertainty about that act favors men and mutes women both before, during, and after date rape. Another case comes from Ellison v. Brady in 1991. Carrie Ellison worked as a revenue agent for the IRS in San Mateo, California. In June of 1986, when no one else was in the office, a co-worker of Ellison, Sterling Gray, asked Ellison to lunch. She accepted, and Ellison alleged that after the lunch, Gray started to pester her with unnecessary questions and hanging around her desk. He repeatedly wrote notes to her, and so he was transferred to the San Francisco office. However, after 6 months, management decided to have him return to the San Mateo office. Ellison filed a formal complaint alleging sexual harassment with the IRS. The Treasury Department found that the complaint did not describe a pattern or practice of sexual harassment covered by the EEOC regulations. The EEOC affirmed that on a different ground, by concluding that the agency took adequate action to prevent the repetition of Gray's conduct. Ellison followed up by filing a complaint in the federal district court, which then granted the government's motion for a summary judgment on the ground that she had failed to state a prima facie, or sufficient to establish a fact or raise a presumption unless disproved or rebutted, case of sexual harassment due to hostile working environment. Ellison challenged the decision of the court. On review, the court established a reasonable victim standard for sexual harassment. Applying the standard to Ellison's case, the court concluded that a reasonable woman would consider the co-worker's behavior to be sufficiently severe and pervasive to alter the conditions of her employment and create an abusive working environment. The court also found that genuine issues of material fact remained concerning whether the IRS's response to Gray's conduct was sufficient under Title VII. The district court was directed to consider the reasonableness of the IRS's decision to remedy the harassment by transferring Gray and Ellison to different locations. Overall, the case was reversed and remanded. Feminist scholars insist that the key communication activities of women's experiences, such as their rituals, vocabularies, metaphors, and stories, are an important part of data for study. This chapter alone presents 30 qualitative studies conducted by women who give voice to the mutedness they've experienced because they aren't men. The theory has also inspired many scholars to take the voices of women and other muted groups seriously. This community of agreement runs roughshod over the disciplinary boundaries that separate scholars in social sciences. Few other interpretive theories in this book can claim such wide-ranging support and enthusiasm. This diverse set of scholars is united in their conviction that by understanding the experiences of muted groups, we also achieve a new understanding of people overall. Steeped in critical tradition, muted group theory is exceedingly candid about trying to clarify values. So, can men be members of a muted group? Yes, especially if those men identify with other marginalized groups. Kramer-Ray also acknowledges that oppression is more complex than identification with any one group. Her perspective on men's motives is contested by scholars, though. Kramer-Ray thinks other scholars' apologies for men's abuses of power, though, is too simple. Rather than blaming style differences, Kramer-Ray points out the way our political, educational, religious, legal, and media systems support gender, race, and class hierarchies. The terms sexual harassment and mansplaining are examples of how women's words can be levered into the public lexicon and reform society by giving voice to women's collective experiences. Phrases like glass ceiling and date rape weren't even around when the Feminist Dictionary was compiled, but now those terms are available to label social and professional injustices that women face, thus reforming society.